Hi guys, tonight we step into a world where winter is not a season but a living pressure pressing against your skin, your breath, your thoughts. You are not standing in a warm room or behind glass. You are outside where the air feels sharp enough to bite the inside of your nose and every sound is softened by snow. Somewhere in the distance, ice cracks like slow thunder. The night is wide, dark and heavy with cold that does not move quickly but never leaves. Before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and let yourself follow the rhythm of a different world. You begin by imagining that you are travelling with a small group moving through winter terrain long before modern roads or insulation exist. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, frozen in places so hard it feels like stone. In other places, snow shifts and collapses, softly hiding depth you cannot see. Your breath rises in pale clouds that vanish almost instantly. The cold is not only around you, it is under you, above you, and inside every pause you take. Your skin tightens. Your fingers lose feeling faster than you expect. You learn quickly that stillness is dangerous because motion is warmth, and warmth is survival. Mainstream historical research confirms that many indigenous groups across North America developed seasonal movement patterns to avoid the harshest winter exposures. They did not simply endure cold, they anticipated it. They moved with it. Archaeological evidence from winter camps shows deliberate placement near wind-protected valleys and water sources that resisted freezing longer. You feel that knowledge now as you follow their logic. Every step is not random. It is calculated in ways that feel almost invisible until you realize how much life depends on them. You come across a small clearing where the wind suddenly weakens. It is not warmer, but it is less violent. That difference matters more than you would think. In the silence of this space, you hear another sound beneath the wind. It is the soft shifting of snow, settling against uneven ground. Fire becomes central here, but not in the way you might first imagine. It's not just a flame, it is a responsibility shared by everyone. Someone always tends it. Someone always watches it. Fire is not left alone even for a moment because once it dies into these conditions, restarting it can mean risking life itself. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some groups use carefully selected resin-rich wood that burned slower and produced thicker smoke, which also acted as a signal marker in vast white landscapes. The smoke was not only heat, it was identity. It told others where safety existed. You crouch near that imagined fire now. You feel the heat on your face, but your back remains cold. That contrast becomes part of survival itself. You shift, often rotating your body just enough to distribute warmth without wasting energy. There is a shared rhythm in these nights. People do not sleep all at once. They rotate rest in patterns that feel almost like breathing. One group watches while another sleeps, then they switch. The fire never stands alone, and neither do the people. Historians still argue whether some winter survival strategies were primarily technological or primarily social in origin. In other words, it is not fully clear whether innovation led to cooperation or cooperation led to innovation. What remains certain is that both were inseparable in practice. You notice how sound changes in this environment. The crunch of movement becomes louder in your awareness because everything else is muted. Even your own breathing feels amplified, as if the cold is listening. Night shelter is not always a built structure. Sometimes it is a shallow depression in snow reinforced with branches or hides. The snow itself becomes part of protection. It traps still air, and still air is slightly warmer than moving wind. That difference is enough to matter. You lower yourself into such a space. The snow does not feel soft anymore. It feels structured, almost intentional, as if the earth itself is offering you temporary protection. Above you, the sky is clear and impossibly wide, filled with stars that seem sharper in winter air. Your body begins to adjust in small ways. Shoulders tighten, knees draw closer. These are not comfort movements. They are survival instincts shaped over generations. Another lesser-known account mentions the use of heated stones placed near resting bodies wrapped carefully in layered hides. These stones release warmth slowly through the night, extending the life of heat far beyond the fire itself. It is a simple idea, but in this environment simplicity becomes genius. You imagine placing one of these stones near your side. The warmth would not be immediate but steady like a quiet pulse against the cold. The snow continues to fall lightly. Not enough to bury, but enough to remind you that nothing here is still. Everything is changing even when it appears frozen. You begin to understand that survival in this world is not about fighting winter directly. It is about negotiating with it. You do not win against cold, you learn how to exist beside it without losing yourself. And in that realization, the night feels less like an enemy and more like a long, difficult conversation. You must learn to continue without stopping. You begin to notice that survival in this frozen world does not depend only on what is immediately in front of you. It depends on what you remember from earlier days, earlier signs, earlier changes that most people would ignore. The cold is never truly sudden here. It builds slowly like a thought forming in the background of the land. The group you travel with does not treat winter as a single event. They treat it as a sequence of signals. The wind changes direction in subtle ways long before storms arrive. The light itself shifts, becoming thinner, angled differently across snowfields that seem identical at first glance but are never truly the same. You walk across frozen terrain where every surface reflects light in fractured patterns. Ice is not smooth everywhere. It is layered, broken, rebuilt by repeated freezing and thawing cycles. When you step, the sound is sharp but controlled, as if the ground is speaking in short, deliberate sentences. A mainstream finding in historical and anthropological research confirms that many indigenous communities across North America relied on detailed seasonal observation systems, often called ecological or phenological knowledge. These systems tracked recurring natural events such as plant dormancy, animal migration, and ice formation patterns to anticipate weather changes long before modern meteorology existed. You start to see how this knowledge is not abstract. It is practical, immediate, and deeply embedded in daily awareness. A change in bird movement is not just an observation, it is a warning. A shift in the timing of frost forming on river edges is not just a curiosity, it becomes a decision point for where to camp or when to move. The cold air presses against your face again as you pause near a line of dark trees. The forest edge feels different from open snowfields. It is quieter but also more alert, as if sound itself is being absorbed by bark and shadow. You can smell wood smoke still lingering faintly from earlier fires, mixed with the sharp scent of frozen sap. One of the most practical survival strategies you begin to understand is the reading of animal behavior, not as superstition, but as observation refined through repetition over countless winters. If small mammals begin storing food earlier or more aggressively, it signals a deeper seasonal shift. If larger animals move their grazing patterns lower into valleys sooner than expected, it often suggests harsher conditions ahead. A quirky detail recorded in some ethnographic accounts describes how the thickness of beaver lodges was sometimes used as an indirect indicator of winter severity. Thicker construction built earlier in the season was interpreted as a response to anticipated harsher cold. While modern science treats such interpretations cautiously, they reveal a consistent pattern of careful environmental attention. You crouch near the edge of a frozen stream, noticing how ice forms in uneven layers. Some parts are opaque white filled with trapped air. Other parts are clear enough that you can see dark water moving slowly beneath like a separate world suspended under glass. The sound here is different too. Water beneath ice does not stop moving. It becomes a low, constant presence. Almost like breathing you cannot see. As you continue moving, you realize that reading the land is not something done occasionally. It is constant. Your attention is never fully at rest. Even cadence becomes information. A sudden absence of wind where it should normally pass through a valley can signal a shift in pressure. A change in how snow drifts against rocks can indicate wind patterns forming hours ahead. Historians still debate how standardized these environmental knowledge systems were across different indigenous nations. Some scholars argue that these were highly localized traditions shaped by specific geography and climate conditions. Others suggest there were broader shared principles of observation that traveled across trade routes and cultural exchange networks. What remains clear is that this knowledge was adaptive, precise, and essential for survival. You feel the weight of that understanding as the sky begins to dim again. Winter light does not fade quickly. It drains slowly like water leaking from a vessel. Shadows lengthened across snow, and temperature seems to fall even before the air itself changes. The group stops briefly near a cluster of trees. You notice how carefully they choose these resting points. It is never random. They avoid exposed ridges where wind cuts hardest. They prefer areas where terrain naturally blocks airflow, creating pockets of stillness that preserve heat even in open environments. You kneel and press your hand into the snow. It feels dry on the surface but denser underneath. This layering matters. Snow is not just cold, it is structure. It can trap air, and trapped air becomes insulation. The same element that threatens life also becomes part of its protection. In the distance, a bird call breaks the silence. It is brief, almost hesitant. You watch how a few heads in the group subtly shift toward the sound. Even a single call can carry meaning here depending on timing and season. It might indicate migration delays or changing food availability, or simply the presence of unexpected movement in the forest. You begin to understand that nothing is dismissed. Everything is weighed, even the smallest detail. Survival depends on noticing patterns before they become obvious. Another observation you learn through immersion is how frost forms differently depending on wind exposure. On sheltered branches, frost grows thick and feathery, accumulating slowly over hours. On exposed surfaces, it forms thin and sharp, almost crystalline. These differences are not just visual. They indicate how heat and moisture move through the landscape. You pull your clothing tighter as the wind returns, slipping between trees like something alive. The cold here is not static. It moves, shifts, gathers. It behaves like a presence that never fully settles. There is a moment of stillness again, where even the wind seems to pause. In that silence you realize how dependent you have become on interpretation. Without reading the environment, the world becomes dangerous in ways that are not immediately visible. And yet, despite the harshness, there is structure here. A rhythm, a logic that is not written but lived. The land speaks constantly, but only to those trained to listen. You continue walking as the first stars begin to appear faintly above the horizon, and the frozen world prepares for another night of quiet negotiation between body breath and endless cold. You notice something subtle as night deepens again. The world does not simply become colder in a straight line. It changes in layers, like invisible tides moving through air and ground at different speeds. Your body feels one version of the cold, your breath another, and the snow beneath you holds something else entirely. Fire becomes more than an idea now. It becomes a point of return, and every movement, every decision eventually circles back to it. You're drawn toward it even when you are not consciously thinking about warmth. The glow, even imagined, feels like orientation in a world where every direction looks the same once darkness settles over snow. As you travel with the group, you see how fire is never treated casually. It is prepared with patience. Wood is sorted by density, by dryness, by how it will burn over time rather than how quickly it ignites. In deep winter conditions, speed is not always helpful. Sustained heat matters more than sudden flame. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter camps often show evidence of long-term fire management rather than simple ignition points. Charcoal layers found in repeated seasonal sites suggest controlled use of fire over extended periods, sometimes in the same locations for generations. This reveals continuity, not improvisation. You step closer to an imagined hearth again. The heat is not just physical, it is directional. One side of your body feels alive while the other remains suspended in cold air. You begin to understand why people constantly shift position around fire. Stillness is inefficient, movement becomes part of warmth maintenance. The sound of winter at this hour is different. It is quieter but more defined. Snow underfoot compresses with a soft crunch that seems louder than it should be. Distant trees creak faintly under the weight that is invisible but constant. Even your clothing produces a soft rustle amplified by silence. A quirky detail preserved in some ethnographic observations describes how certain groups would use resin-soaked bundles of wood not only for heat, but also for extended night lighting. These burned with a steady glow that lasted longer than typical flames, reducing the need for constant tending. In a world where sleep is fragmented, this kind of light becomes almost like a companion. You imagine that steady glow now, not bright like daylight, but persistent like a small heartbeat in darkness. The group continues moving through terrain that shifts between open snow and scattered tree cover. You begin to notice how they read terrain in ways that are almost tactile. Slight depressions in ground are evaluated for wind shelter. Tree density is assessed not just for firewood availability, but for how it disrupts airflow. You feel the wind change again as you enter a more sheltered stretch. It does not disappear. It simply loses force as if it has been softened by contact with branches and uneven ground. This reduction in the movement makes the cold feel different, less aggressive but more constant. You learn that still air can sometimes be more dangerous than moving air in certain conditions. Without movement, moisture can settle more heavily on skin and fabric, increasing heat loss over time. Survival here is not about eliminating wind, it is about negotiating with it. Your breath becomes more noticeable again. Each exhale briefly fogs your vision before fading. You start to recognize patterns in your own breathing, almost like another environmental signal. When breath becomes too shallow, warmth decreases faster. When it becomes too deep, energy is wasted. Balance is everything. Historians still debate how much of this survival knowledge was consciously taught versus unconsciously absorbed through constant exposure. Some argue that children growing up in these environments learned through imitation and repetition rather than formal instruction. Others suggest structured teaching existed in storytelling and seasonal practice, embedding knowledge in narrative rather than instruction. You pass a cluster of low branches weighed down by snow. They bend under pressure but do not break. The snow here is not light. It accumulates in layers that compress into something denser than you first expect. You reach out and touch it. It resists slightly, like something between powder and solid ground. Snow itself becomes a resource in this world, not just an obstacle. It can insulate shelters, reduce wind exposure, and even help regulate temperature differences between ground and air. You begin to see why people do not simply avoid it, they use it. As darkness deepens further, the group slows again. You sense preparation without needing explanation. Small adjustments begin. Hides are repositioned, packs are tightened. Movement becomes more deliberate, less exploratory. The night is settling fully now, and with it comes the need for stability. Another lesser-known observation from historical records describes how heated stones were sometimes placed inside wrapped animal skins and positioned near sleeping bodies to extend warmth through long winter nights. These stones released heat, slowly creating a delayed warmth that outlasted open flame. It is a simple principle, but its effect in extreme cold is profound. You imagine the weight of one of those stones beside you now, not hot enough to burn, but steady enough to anchor you against the surrounding cold. The forest around you feels different as night fully arrives. Shapes become less distinct, trees turn into silhouettes rather than objects. Depth becomes harder to judge. In this environment, certainty decreases and awareness increases. You begin to rely more on sound and less on sight. A small movement nearby causes several heads in the group to turn slightly. It is not alarm but attention. Even minor changes in the environment are not ignored. A shifting branch, a distant animal step, and change in wind direction. Everything is noted even if nothing immediately follows. You start to understand that survival here is not a dramatic act. It is accumulation. Small decisions layered over time, adjustments made before crisis arrives, awareness maintained even in moments of rest. The cold deepens again, but it is no longer surprising. It is expected. You begin to sense it as rhythm rather than interruption. It rises, it pauses, it settles. Your body responds accordingly, tightening, adjusting, conserving. Above you, the stars appear sharper again, as if the sky itself has been polished by temperature. The world is quiet now, not empty but concentrated. Every sound matters more because there are so few of them. And in that quiet you realize something subtle. You're not only observing survival, you're being taught its tempo, its patience, its refusal to rush even when everything around you demands urgency. The night continues steady and unbroken as you move deeper into understanding how life persists in places where warmth must always be earned. You begin this part of the night by noticing how the land itself starts to feel less like a backdrop and more like an active participant in your survival. Every slope, every hollow, every stand of trees seems to carry intention once you know how to read it. Nothing here is random, even when it appears untouched. The group moves with quiet purpose and you follow their pace carefully. The snow underfoot is uneven again, sometimes soft and yielding, sometimes packed into hard ridges shaped by wind. Each step requires attention. You learn quickly that careless movement wastes energy, and in this cold energy is more valuable than speed. Fire is still present in your mind even when you cannot see it. It becomes something like a reference point, not just warmth, but orientation. You understand why camps are built around it, why people cluster near it, why its absence feels larger than its presence. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that many winter camps across Indigenous North America were designed with wind protection as the primary architectural principle. Rather than focusing only on enclosure structures, were often oriented to deflect prevailing winds using natural terrain or constructed barriers to reduce exposure. Shelter was not a box, it was a strategy. You pass through a shallow depression in the landscape and immediately the air feels different. Not warmer in any dramatic sense, but less aggressive. The wind loses some of its force here, as if the land itself is absorbing its impact. You instinctively slow down, sensing the value of this place. The sound of the world changes again. In open areas, wind dominates everything, filling space with constant pressure. Here, sound becomes layered. You hear your own breathing more clearly. You hear snow shifting in small collapses as it settles. Even distant movement feels closer. A quirky detail recorded in some ethnographic accounts describes how some groups intentionally built temporary windbreaks as using stacked snow blocks or branches not for permanent shelter, but for creating pockets of still air during rest periods. These structures could be assembled quickly and often made the difference between exhausting exposure and survivable rest. You imagine those barriers now, simple, practical, almost fragile in appearance, yet powerful in effect. They do not stop winter, they negotiate with it. As you move further, you notice how trees begin to cluster more tightly. Their presence is not just visual, it is functional. Dense tree growth disrupts wind flow, creating unpredictable pockets of calm and turbulence. You feel the temperature shift slightly as you pass between open and enclosed spaces, like stepping through invisible layers. Your body responds continuously to these micro changes. Shoulders tighten in exposed areas, relax slightly in sheltered ones. This constant adjustment becomes part of survival rhythm. Stillness is not an option. Even comfort requires monitoring. Historians still debate the extent to which indigenous winter shelter strategies were standardized versus locally adapted. Some argue that there were shared foundational principles such as wind avoidance and heat retention. Others emphasize that each region developed distinct methods shaped by terrain climate and available materials. Both perspectives likely hold truth depending on context. You notice that snow behaves differently under trees. It falls more unevenly, collecting in irregular mounds rather than smooth layers. Some of it remains untouched by the wind for longer periods, preserving softer textures beneath surface crusts. You step carefully, aware that hidden depth can still exist even in seemingly stable ground. The group pauses, again near a line of natural rock formations. These are not shelters, but they function like anchors in the landscape. Wind wraps around them rather than passing directly through. You instinctively move closer to the leeward side, feeling the difference immediately. It is subtle but unmistakable. The cold is still present, but its intensity changes. It becomes less physical pressure and more ambient condition. Another observation from historical and ecological studies suggests that indigenous groups often selected camp locations not just for resources, but for thermal stability. Areas that maintained slightly higher ground temperatures or reduced wind exposure were prioritized even if they required longer travel routes. Efficiency was measured in survival, not distance. You crouch again and press your hand into the snow. The surface is firm, but underneath it has softness, almost like compressed air held in place. This layered structure creates insulation. You begin to understand why snow is not simply an obstacle. It is a material with properties that can be used. The sky above darkens further, but it is not empty. Stars remain visible, sharp and distant. Their clarity is heightened by the cold, as if temperature has reduced atmospheric interference. The world feels both vast and confined at the same time. You adjust your position again without thinking. Your body has started to prioritize heat conservation automatically. Limbs draw closer, weight shifts. Even breathing becomes more intentional. These are not decisions anymore, they are responses. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves using layered hides combined with ground insulation such as branches or packed vegetation to reduce heat loss into frozen earth. Since ground contact can drain warmth faster than air exposure in extreme cold, even small barriers beneath resting bodies become critical. You imagine lying on such a surface now, not comfortable in any modern sense but functional. Survival here does not aim for comfort, it aims for continuity. The group's movement becomes slower as night deepens. You sense that rest is approaching, but not fully. There is always a threshold moment in these environments where movement transitions into stillness, but never fully stops. Someone will always remain aware, someone will always listen. Wind rises briefly again, threading through trees with a low distant sound. It does not last long, but it reminds you that conditions remain unstable. The environment is never fully settled, only temporarily manageable. You begin to understand that shelter here is not a structure you enter. It is a condition you create and maintain. A balance between exposure and protection constantly adjusted as circumstances change. And as you continue through this frozen landscape, you feel that balance more clearly than ever, like a quiet negotiation between body and world that never fully ends, only pauses for brief moments of relative calm. You begin this part of the night with a deeper awareness of your own body, as if the cold has trained your attention inward as much as outward. Every small sensation becomes meaningful. The tightening of skin, the slow dulling of fingers, the way breath feels slightly heavier in the chest, nothing is ignored anymore. The group continues moving, but their pace is not hurried. It is measured, almost cautious, in a way that suggests familiarity rather than fear. You realize that in this environment, urgency is often the first mistake. Movement must be efficient, not fast. Fire remains a distant anchor in your awareness, even when unseen. You start to understand it less as an object and more as a system. It is not only heat, it is coordination, memory, responsibility shared across people who rotate care throughout the night. A mainstream ethnographic and archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival strategies across North America often relied on layered clothing systems made from animal hides, fur, and insulating plant materials. These were not single garments, but integrated systems designed to trap air and reduce heat loss through multiple barriers. You begin to feel this logic as if it is surrounding you. Each layer is not just protection, but spacing. The cold does not stop at the outer surface. It tries to travel inward, and every layer slows it down, weakens it, disperses it. As you move through a more sheltered stretch of terrain, the wind becomes less direct. It does not disappear, but it changes behavior. It slips between trees rather than striking openly. You notice how this alters your perception of temperature. The cold feels less violent but more persistent. Snow underfoot is uneven again. Some areas are crusted hard, forming a thin surface that cracks softly under pressure. Other areas are softer, concealing depth beneath what appears solid. You adjust your steps, constantly learning to trust texture more than appearance. A quirky detail preserved in some historical accounts describes how fur garments were often worn with the fur side inward during extreme cold conditions, maximizing heat retention against the body, while the outer layer provided wind resistance and moisture protection. This reversal of outward appearance versus functional interior warmth reflects deep practical understanding of insulation principles. You imagine that sensation now. Soft fur against skin trapping warmth close while the outside remains harsh and unyielding. It is a small inversion of expectations, but in this world inversion becomes logic. The group pauses briefly near a cluster of low shrubs partially buried in snow. These plants are dormant but still shape the landscape. Even in winter they influence wind movement and snow accumulation patterns. You notice how snow gathers differently around them, forming uneven contours that reveal underlying structure. Historians still debate how much plant knowledge contributed to winter survival beyond food use. Some argue that vegetation played a crucial role in environmental reading, helping people interpret moisture levels, soil conditions, and seasonal transitions. Others emphasize its role in fuel shelter and tool-making materials. Likely it functioned in all these ways simultaneously. You crouch again, brushing snow aside with careful movement. The air immediately feels colder near the ground, as if the earth itself holds a deeper chill. This contrast between ground and air temperature becomes increasingly important as you begin to understand where heat is lost most quickly. Your body reacts continuously now without conscious instruction. Shoulders lift slightly in exposed areas. Breathing shortens when wind increases. Hands tuck closer to core warmth zones. These adjustments are subtle but constant, forming a quiet choreography of survival. Another observation from historical records describes how animal fats were sometimes applied to exposed skin or outer clothing surfaces as a form of moisture barrier. While not creating warmth directly, this practice reduced wind penetration and helped preserve internal heat by limiting evaporation and dampness exposure. You imagine that protective layer now. Not thick armor, but a thin practical coating that changes how wind interacts with surface, skin, and fabric. The sky above shifts again as night deepens. Stars remain present, but their brightness feels sharper, almost more detached from the world below. The cold air reduces haze and distortion, making distant light feel more precise, more distant. You notice how silence changes too. It is no longer absence of sound, it becomes presence of stillness. Even small noises feel suspended in it, as if the air itself holds them briefly before letting them fade. The group begins to slow again, and you sense preparation without instruction. Small adjustments in posture, slight changes in spacing between individuals, careful evaluation of terrain. These are not dramatic signals, they are practiced habits. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves shared body positioning during rest, where individuals cluster closely to reduce exposed surface area and collectively retain heat. This is not simply comfort. It is thermal efficiency, a biological and social strategy combined. You understand this more deeply now as you feel how your own body would respond to proximity. Heat becomes something shared, not owned. Wind rises briefly again, passing through tree branches with a sound like distant movement rather than force. It does not linger, but it reinforces awareness that conditions are always shifting even when they appear stable. You begin to recognize a pattern in everything now. Nothing is fixed. Not temperature, not wind, not even silence. Everything moves in cycles, and survival depends on staying aligned with those cycles rather than resisting them. And as the group settles into a quieter rhythm, you feel yourself becoming part of that pattern too, not separate from the cold but moving alongside it, adjusting continuously, learning its language, one breath at a time. You begin this section by noticing how the night no longer feels like a single stretch of time. It feels divided into phases each, with its own temperature, its own silence, its own way of pressing against your awareness. The cold is not static. It evolves even when everything around you appears frozen. The group has slowed further now, and you sense that rest is becoming more important than movement. But even rest here is not abandonment of awareness. It is controlled, measured, and shared. You understand quickly that no one in this environment fully stops. They only shift the form of attention. Fire, whether present or imagined, continues to shape your thoughts. It is no longer just warmth or light, it is structure. It organizes behavior. It determines where bodies gather, how long they remain still, and when they must move again. A mainstream ethnographic understanding confirms that many indigenous winter survival practices across North America emphasized communal heat retention through shared sleeping arrangements. Bodies clustered together, not only for social reasons, but because collective warmth significantly reduced individual heat loss in extreme cold environments. You feel this principle in your awareness now even without physical contact. The idea of proximity becomes functional rather than emotional. Distance equals exposure, closeness equals survival efficiency. The ground beneath you shifts slightly as you move into a more sheltered hollow. It is subtle but immediately noticeable. The wind loses some of its sharpness. It still exists, but it no longer dominates the space. Instead, it moves above and around you rather than directly through you. Snow here is deeper, less compacted. It gives slightly underweight, absorbing sound in a way that makes every step feel quieter. You begin to notice how silence itself changes with terrain. Some places hold sound longer, others erase it almost instantly. A quirky detail recorded in some historical accounts describes how certain winter camps use deliberately packed snow walls, not only as wind barriers but also as acoustic buffers, reducing the transmission of sound and helping maintain a sense of stillness that conserved both energy and awareness during long nights. You imagine this muffled world now, a space where sound does not travel far, where even movement feels absorbed by the environment rather than reflected back. The group pauses again, and you instinctively mirror their stillness. This pause is not random, it is part of rhythm. Movement and rest alternate in cycles that feel increasingly natural to you, as if your body is beginning to understand the logic behind them. You notice your breathing more clearly again. It has become slower, more deliberate. In extreme cold, fast breathing would waste energy and moisture. Slow, controlled breathing preserves both. You realize how much survival here depends on conserving what cannot be easily replaced. Historians still debate how much of this physiological awareness was explicitly understood versus intuitively practiced. Some suggest that indigenous survival knowledge included deep observational understanding of bodily responses to cold. Others argue that these practices emerged through long-term cultural refinement rather than formal physiological theory. You crouch again, touching the snow. It feels different at this depth. Less brittle, more compressed. It resists slightly under your hand, as if holding together a hidden structure of air and ice. You begin to see snow not as uniform cold matter, but as layered insulation shaped by time and pressure. Your clothing shifts as you move. Fabric rustles softly, but even that sound feels subdued. Everything here is softened except the cold itself, which remains precise and constant. Another observation from historical sources describes how animal hides were often layered with different orientations to maximize insulation, with coarser outer layers deflecting wind and finer inner layers trapping heat close to the body. This layering was not arbitrary. It was functional engineering developed through long experience. You imagine those layers now wrapping around you, each one slightly changing how the cold reaches your skin. not blocking it entirely but slowing it, fragmenting it into something less harmful. The sky above remains open, but its darkness deepens further. Stars appear more numerous, not because they multiply, but because everything else becomes less visible. Light becomes scarce and therefore more significant. The group begins subtle preparation for longer stillness. You notice changes in posture again. Slight adjustments in stance, repositioning of weight, tightening of carried materials. These are not dramatic actions, they are efficiency movements reducing future strain. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically shifting sleeping positions throughout the night to prevent localized heat loss and maintain circulation. Even small changes in posture could influence survival outcomes in extended cold exposure. You realize now that stillness is never absolute. Even sleep is managed. Even rest is structured. Wind moves again through the upper branches of nearby trees, producing a distant hollow sound. It does not reach you directly here, but its presence is still felt. You begin to understand that the environment is layered vertically as well as horizontally. What happens above influences what is experienced below. The cold seems less like an enemy now, and more like a condition that must be continuously interpreted. It is not trying to defeat you in a single moment. It is shaping everything slowly, persistently, without pause. And as you continue through this layered night, you feel yourself becoming more attuned to those subtle shifts, learning not just to endure them, but to exist within their rhythm, where survival is not resistance, but careful ongoing balance. You begin to notice that direction matters more than distance in this frozen world. A short walk into exposed wind can feel harsher than hours spent in sheltered terrain. The land is no longer measured only in space, but in resistance, in how much force it demands from your body. The group shifts again, and you follow closely, sensing that they are searching for a place that offers balance rather than perfection. There is no perfect shelter here, only degrees of exposure and protection. Every decision is about reducing loss, not eliminating it. Fire continues to live in your awareness as something almost symbolic now. You think of it as a center of gravity. Even when it is not physically present, it organizes behavior around its imagined position. People move as if it is always somewhere nearby, waiting to be reached again. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that many indigenous winter camps were deliberately placed in locations that balanced access to resources with protection from prevailing winter winds. These placements often reflect deep environmental knowledge where geography itself was used as a form of structural shelter. You pass through a narrow corridor between rock outcrops. Immediately the wind changes behavior again. It does not stop, but it loses its directness. It bends and swirls instead of striking straight. You feel your body respond without thinking. Shoulders loosen slightly, breathing steadies. Snow here is uneven, shaped by long-term wind movement. Some areas are stripped almost bare, while others are piled into soft drifts that rise unexpectedly against stone. You begin to understand that snow is not passive. It is constantly sculpted by invisible forces. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic observations describes how certain groups use natural rock formations as wind deflectors for winter rest areas, sometimes enhancing them with temporary additions of branches or packed snow to further reduce airflow. These hybrid shelters were adaptive, using what already existed rather than building from scratch. You imagine resting behind such a formation. The rock would not warm you, but it would protect you from the worst of movement. In this environment, reduction of force is a kind of survival. The group slows again, and you sense evaluation taking place. Not spoken, but understood. Eyes scan terrain. Bodies orient subtly. There is an unspoken agreement forming about where the night might be endured. You kneel briefly and press your hand into the snow. It feels denser here, compressed by wind and time. The cold is more stable in these areas, less chaotic. That stability itself becomes valuable because unpredictability is exhausting. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter site selection was based on accumulated generational knowledge versus immediate environmental reading. Some argue that oral tradition preserved long-term landscape memory, allowing people to recognize safe seasonal locations even after long absences. Others emphasize real-time observation as the primary decision-making tool. You begin to see how both must have worked together, memory and observation layered like clothing, each supporting the other. The wind shifts again above the rocks, producing a low, distant sound. It is not loud, but it carries presence. You become aware of how sound travels differently in these spaces. It does not move evenly. It bends, weakens, or strengthens depending on shape and direction. Your breath fogs briefly again in front of you. Each exhale is a small signal of warmth lost. You begin to notice how much energy is constantly being released without return. Survival here is partly about minimizing invisible loss. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulated sleeping arrangements often included layered ground coverings made from branches, hides, or woven plant material to reduce direct contact with frozen earth. The ground in extreme cold behaves like a slow heat sink, drawing warmth away continuously unless interrupted. You imagine that barrier now beneath you, a separation between body and frozen ground, not comfort but protection against steady loss. The group begins arranging themselves more deliberately now. Spacing changes slightly. Positions adjust to reduce exposure and improve shared sheltering potential. Even without full structures, arrangement itself becomes architecture. You notice how silence deepens as movement slows. Not emptiness, but concentration. Every small sound becomes more noticeable. Fabric shifting, snow settling, a distant branch creaking under weight. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves rotating outer positions within a group during extreme cold exposure, ensuring that no single individual remains constantly exposed to wind. This rotation spreads thermal burden across multiple people over time. You understand now that survival here is not individual optimization, it is shared burden management. The sky remains open, but feels closer somehow, as if the cold has drawn it downward. Stars continue to shine, but they feel less like decoration, and more like distant markers in a vast, indifferent space. Wind rises briefly again, then slips away through the rock corridor. You feel its absence more than its presence. That absence becomes information. It tells you where protection begins and ends. And as the group settles further into this sheltered geography, you begin to sense how survival is increasingly about positioning, about finding and maintaining those fragile pockets where the world is just slightly less aggressive, just enough to allow life to continue. You begin this part of the night by noticing how even the idea of warmth has started to change in your mind. It is no longer a simple sensation. It is a gradient, something that exists in degrees rather than presence or absence. In this frozen world, everything is measured by how much it reduces loss. The group remains within the sheltered geography you entered earlier, and you can feel how that choice continues to matter. The rocks, the uneven ground, and the clustered trees all combine into a kind of broken shield against the wind. Nothing here is perfect, but everything contributes. Fire remains a constant presence in your awareness even when unseen. It is not just a tool or a necessity, it is a reference point for human organization in the cold. Around it time is measured, around it movement is structured, around it survival decisions are made. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival practices often made use of natural wind shadows created by terrain features, such as cliffs, tree lines, and valley bends. These features were essential in reducing exposure during rest periods and often determined seasonal camp locations. You feel this principle physically as you stand in the partial shelter of rock and snow. The wind is still present above, but it no longer strikes directly. It moves like a distant force rather than a constant pressure. That difference is subtle but deeply significant. Tano here behaves differently again. It is not drifting as aggressively. It settles in thicker layers, shaped more by gravity than wind. You notice how it accumulates in quiet folds against stone, forming natural insulation zones that hold still air beneath their surface. A quirky detail recorded In some ethnographic accounts, describes how certain winter shelters were enhanced by intentionally piling snow against outer barriers, creating additional insulating layers that reduced wind penetration and stabilized internal temperature zones. Snow in this sense becomes construction material rather than obstacle. You imagine these layered walls now not as fragile piles, but as structured defences built from something that would otherwise be a threat. The group adjusts again, and you sense that the night is entering a more stationary phase. Movement slows to essential actions only. Even small adjustments become deliberate. The rhythm shifts from travel to endurance. You become more aware of your own body again. The cold has refined your attention inward. Fingers feel slightly distant, not numb yet, but less responsive than before. Your breathing remains steady, but each inhale feels more intentional, as if the body is conserving motion itself. Historians still debate how much of Indigenous cold weather adaptation was physiological acclimatization versus cultural practice. Some scholars suggest that long-term exposure across generations may have contributed to subtle physiological resilience. Others emphasize behavioral adaptation as the primary factor, with clothing, shelter, and movement strategies doing most of the survival work. You crouch again near the snow surface. It appears simple at first glance, but closer observation reveals structure. Layers of ice crystals, compacted air pockets, and varying densities create a material that is both fragile and insulating depending on how it is used. Your hand lingers near the surface. The cold rises slowly through contact, not abrupt but steady. You begin to understand why direct exposure to ground is so dangerous over time. It is not immediate shock, but continuous extraction of warmth. Another observation from historical sources describes how sleeping arrangements often included elevated bedding platforms or layered natural insulation to minimize contact with frozen ground. Even a few inches of separation could significantly reduce heat loss during long winter nights. You imagine that separation now as a crucial boundary between survival and exhaustion. The wind shifts again above the rocks, but its sound is softened here. Instead of a sharp force, it becomes a distant movement, like something passing without entering. You realize that shelter in this environment is often defined not by walls, but by the absence of direct contact with environmental pressure. The group's posture changes subtly once more. Bodies draw slightly closer. Packs are repositioned. Space is negotiated without words. You begin to recognize this as a form of silent coordination, where each adjustment contributes to shared protection. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves using natural depressions in terrain as sleeping zones, allowing body heat to accumulate in low points where wind exposure is minimal and heat retention is slightly improved. These micro-landscapes become critical survival assets. You begin to see the ground itself differently now, not as flat terrain, but as a series of survival opportunities shaped by subtle variations in elevation. The sky remains clear, but its depth feels more distant now. Stars are still present, but they no longer dominate attention. Instead, awareness turns downward toward immediate conditions, toward what can be controlled or adjusted. Silence deepens again, but it is not empty. It is layered with small, almost imperceptible sounds. Fabric shifting, snow settling, occasional distant movement in trees. Each sound becomes meaningful precisely because so little noise exists. You feel the rhythm of endurance more clearly now. It is not dramatic, it is repetitive. Adjust, observe, conserve, repeat. Survival becomes a loop rather than an event. And as the group settles further into this protected geography, you realize that even here, safety is never complete. It is only reduced exposure, temporary balance, and continuous awareness of everything that still surrounds you. You begin this section with a quieter kind of awareness, as if the night itself has settled deeper into the land and into you. The cold is no longer surprising. It has become background condition, something that frames every thought rather than interrupting it. The group remains within the sheltered terrain and movement is minimal now. You sense that the focus has shifted from travel to maintenance. Everything done from this point is about holding warmth, preserving energy, and managing exposure through the long hours ahead. Fire continues to exist in your mind as a steady center. Even without seeing it, you feel its influence shaping behavior. Where people sit, how they cluster, how they shift positions over time. It is less an object and more a gravitational point for survival logic. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival practices often included the use of readily available natural materials for temporary shelter construction, such as birch bark, conifer branches, and flexible saplings. These materials allowed for quick adaptation to sudden weather changes without requiring permanent structures. You notice how this principle feels alive here in your imagination. Nothing is permanent, everything is responsive. Shelter is not built once, it is rebuilt, adjusted, and reshaped as conditions shift. The snow around you appears calm, but it is not static. It compresses slowly under its own weight, forming subtle layers that differ in density. Some areas are airy and soft, others are firm and compacted, shaped by wind patterns earlier in the night. A quirky detail preserved in some ethnographic accounts describes how birch bark was especially valued in winter construction, not only for its flexibility, but also for its natural resistance to moisture, allowing it to function as a temporary waterproof layer in improvised shelters. It was light portable and remarkably adaptable. You imagine handling such material now, its surface smooth but slightly resistant bending without breaking, forming quick protection against wind and snow. The group remains still but not inactive. Even in rest there is awareness. Small adjustments occur constantly, a shift of weight, a tightening of clothing, a repositioning to reduce wind exposure. These actions are subtle, almost invisible but essential. You begin to feel your own body mirroring this behavior. Stillness is not complete, it is steadiness. Your shoulders adjust slightly as temperature changes. Your breathing slows and steadies, conserving moisture and energy. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter shelter knowledge was tied to specific architectural traditions versus flexible improvisation. Some scholars argue that portable shelter systems were highly standardized within certain regions, while others emphasize the adaptability of designs to rapidly changing environmental conditions. You crouch again, observing the snow more closely. It is not uniform. It reveals traces of past movement, wind shifts, and temperature fluctuations. Even frozen ground holds a record of change if you know how to read it. Your fingers hover near the surface. The cold feels deeper here, not sharper but more sustained. It lingers rather than strikes. This kind of cold is harder to notice at first, but more demanding over time. Another observation from historical sources describes how some winter groups used layered coverings over sleeping areas, combining branches, hides, and snow insulation to create multi-layered protection zones. These systems were designed not to eliminate cold, but to slow its penetration across time. You begin to understand that time itself is part of survival here. It is not just temperature that matters, but duration of exposure. Wind passes above the rocks again, but its presence is faint. You notice how your perception of it has changed. Earlier it was a force, now it is a background variable. Still important, but less dominant due to improved sheltering conditions. The group subtly reorganizes again. Not dramatically, but with intention. Positions shift closer together. Exposed edges are minimized. You realize that even in silence, coordination continues. It is constant low intensity and shared without instruction. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves rotating outer sleeping positions periodically throughout the night, ensuring that no single individual remains continuously exposed to wind and cold. This shared burden system distributes thermal stress across the group. You begin to understand survival here as something collective rather than individual. Even rest is structured around fairness of exposure. The sky above remains clear and immense, but your attention is less drawn to it now. Instead, awareness focuses on immediate space, ground wind body proximity, The macro world fades slightly as micro conditions become more important. Silence deepens again. Not emptiness, but concentration. Every sound is faint but meaningful. The slight shift of fabric, a distant branch under snow load, the quiet compression of air as wind moves far above. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steady and unbroken. It is not dramatic or heroic. It is repetition layered with attention. Each moment is managed, not endured passively, but actively maintained. And as the night continues within this sheltered terrain, you realize that survival here is not a single act of strength. It is a continuous negotiation with cold space and time carried out in small, almost invisible adjustments that never fully stop. You begin this part of the night with a growing sense that time is no longer moving in a straight line. Instead, it feels circular, shaped by repeating patterns of movement, rest, and awareness. The cold reinforces this feeling because it does not progress in a simple way. It rises, it pauses, it returns. The group remains settled in the sheltered geography, and you can feel how stability here is always temporary. Nothing is fully secure, but some places reduce exposure enough to allow short cycles of rest. That is all survival asks for in this environment, not permanence, but intervals of safety. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a central organizing force. Even without flame, it shapes how you imagine space, where bodies gather, how attention is distributed, how the night is divided into watchfulness and rest. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often relied on structured night watch rotations, ensuring that fire maintenance, environmental awareness, and group safety were continuously managed. This prevented total vulnerability during sleep cycles in extreme cold conditions. You begin to feel how this logic extends beyond fire itself. It becomes a system of shared responsibility. No one is fully off duty. Even rest is part of a larger cycle of awareness distributed across the group. The snow around you is quieter now, as if it has settled into its own version of stillness. It no longer shifts as much under wind. Instead, it holds shape, forming uneven surfaces that reflect faint starlight in broken, scattered patterns. A quirky detail recorded in some ethnographic accounts describes how snow shelters or windbreak zones sometimes required periodic reinforcement during long nights, as shifting temperature gradients could cause subtle structural changes. Small collapses or drift would be corrected to maintain insulation efficiency. You imagine someone quietly adjusting snow walls in darkness, hands moving slowly, carefully, without breaking the rhythm of rest too much. The group's stillness is not complete. You notice subtle cycles of movement continuing beneath the surface of rest. A change in posture, a shift in balance, a slight repositioning closer to shared warmth zones. You begin to understand that stillness here is always active. It is not absence of movement. It is controlled minimal movement designed to preserve energy and heat. Your breathing becomes more noticeable again as attention turns inward. The cold encourages conservation at every level. Breath, movement, thought. Everything slows slightly as if the body itself is aligning with environmental demands. Historians still debate how much of indigenous cold weather survival was based on formalized systems versus embodied knowledge passed through experience. Some argue that repeated exposure created intuitive understanding of energy conservation. Others emphasize structured teaching embedded in seasonal practices and communal living. You crouch slightly, feeling how your body responds to the ground again. The snow here feels compacted, shaped by both wind and repeated presence. It is no longer just surface, it is memory of movement and pressure. Your hand hovers near it and the cold rises slowly through distance. It does not shock, it accumulates. This is the kind of cold that works gradually, demanding attention over time, rather than in a single moment. Another observation from historical sources describes how some winter survival systems incorporated insulated sleeping arrangements using layered materials such as bark branches and hides designed specifically to reduce heat transfer into frozen ground. Even small separations between body and earth significantly improve thermal retention. You imagine this layered foundation now as a buffer between yourself and endless cold beneath. The wind above shifts again, but its presence is distant here. It passes over rock and tree rather than through the sheltered space. You notice how important vertical structure is in shaping experience. Even slight elevation differences can dramatically alter exposure. The group subtly adjusts once more. Positions change in small increments. Space is optimized without discussion. You realize that coordination here is constant and silent. It exists in micro-decisions rather than spoken instruction. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically exchanging outer and inner sleeping positions within a group to balance exposure and heat retention. This rotation ensured fairness and prevented any one individual from bearing disproportionate cold stress. You begin to see survival as a shared system of load balancing, not just physical, but thermal and energetic. The sky remains open, but your attention is no longer drawn upward as much. The vastness above feels less important than the immediate conditions surrounding you. Ground, wind, proximity, breath. These become the real landscape of survival. Silence deepens again, but it's not empty. It is structured by small, almost imperceptible sounds. Snow settling, fabric shifting, occasional distant movement in trees. Each sound carries meaning precisely because there is so little of it. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steadily. It does not accelerate or decline, it simply persists. Adjust, conserve, observe, repeat. The cycle becomes more natural the longer you remain within it. And as the night continues through this sheltered space, you begin to understand that survival here is not about conquering conditions. It is about maintaining alignment with them moment by moment through continuous, careful attention that never fully stops. You begin this section with a subtle shift in awareness, as if your attention is no longer divided between body and environment, but slowly merging them into a single system of response. The cold is not something outside you anymore. It is something you constantly negotiate with from within. The group remains in a stable formation within the sheltered terrain, and the movement is minimal now. The night has entered a deeper phase where survival is less about travel and more about maintaining internal balance against steady heat loss. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a quiet center of structure. Even without visible flame, it organizes how you imagine the space. It defines where safety would be strongest, where bodies would cluster, where attention would rotate. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often incorporated heat-retaining techniques such as warmed stones placed within insulating materials. These stones released stored heat, gradually extending warmth far beyond the lifespan of an open flame. You imagine that slow release of warmth now, not sudden heat but a steady presence that fades gently rather than disappearing abruptly. In this world, anything that lasts longer is more valuable than anything that burns brighter. The snow around you remains stable, but its appearance changes under shifting starlight. It reflects faint illumination, unevenly creating patterns that feel almost textured in the darkness. Some areas glow softly, while others remain deeply shadowed, giving the landscape a layered depth. A quirky detail recorded in ethnographic accounts describes how heated stones were sometimes wrapped in multiple layers of hide, or placed within shallow ground depressions near sleeping areas, creating localized warm zones that could be shared among several individuals without direct contact with fire. You picture this carefully constructed warmth hidden, but effective like a quiet pulse beneath layers of protection. The group adjusts again, but only slightly. These movements are nearly invisible unless you are paying close attention. A shift of weight, a change in hand position, a subtle repositioning to reduce exposed surface area to wind. You begin to notice your own body following similar patterns. Stillness is not absolute here. It is a form of controlled reduction in motion, not its absence. Even rest becomes a process of optimization. Your breathing feels slower again, and you become aware of how carefully the body manages moisture loss. In extreme cold, breath itself becomes a form of energy exchange. Every exhale carries both warmth and water vapor away from the body. Historians still debate how deeply indigenous winter survival knowledge included conscious awareness of physiological processes. Some argue that such understanding was experiential rather than analytical, built through long-term observation rather than theoretical explanation. You shift slightly in place, feeling how the ground responds differently at this depth of snow. It's no longer just cold surface. It is a layered structure of compressed air and ice crystals, each layer influencing how heat moves between body and earth. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulating bedding systems often relied on layering organic materials in specific sequences, with coarse materials beneath finer insulating layers designed to trap still air and reduce conductive heat loss. You imagine this structured layering beneath you now forming a barrier that slows the constant drain of warmth into frozen ground. Wind moves faintly above the rocks again, but its presence is distant. It does not penetrate this space directly. Instead, it passes overhead, creating a sense of separation between exposed and sheltered environments. The group remains coordinated with outspoken instruction. Positions are maintained, adjusted, and reinforced through small shared understanding. You realize that communication here exists in behavior rather than language. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodic micro-adjustments in sleeping positions throughout the night to prevent localized cooling and maintain circulation in exposed limbs. These small movements reduce the risk of prolonged cold stress in any single area of the body. You begin to understand how even rest must remain dynamic. Stillness, if too absolute, becomes dangerous. The sky above remains vast and clear, but it feels more distant now. Your attention remains grounded in immediate conditions: temperature, wind direction, body position, proximity to others. These form the real architecture of survival. Silence deepens again, but it is not empty. It is full of small, almost imperceptible signals: snow settling under its own weight, fabric shifting softly, a distant tree creaking under frozen load. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not dramatic or emotional. It is mechanical in its repetition, yet deeply human in its coordination. Adjust, conserve, observe, repeat. And as the night continues within this quiet, sheltered geography, you begin to understand that survival here is not defined by moments of strength, but by continuous, careful maintenance of balance against an environment that never stops applying pressure. You begin this section with a growing awareness that even the smallest movement carries consequence in this frozen world. Nothing is neutral here. Every shift of the body either preserves heat or releases it, either protects or exposes, either stabilizes or weakens your position. The group remains in its quiet formation, and you notice how the night has settled into a deeper rhythm. It is no longer marked by travel or decision-making, but by maintenance. Everything now is about sustaining what has already been established. Fire continues to shape your awareness even in its absence. It is no longer just warmth or light. It is coordination across time. It determines how long people stay still when they rotate positions, when attention must be renewed even during rest. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival practices often relied heavily on careful control of clothing layers, with garments designed to be adjusted dynamically rather than worn in a fixed configuration. This allowed individuals to regulate heat retention and ventilation depending on activity level and exposure. You begin to feel this principle in your imagination of movement. Clothing is not static protection. It is a system that must respond to changing conditions. Too tight and moisture builds, too loose and heat escapes. Balance is constantly required. The snow beneath you appears unchanged at first glance, but you now recognize that it is never truly still. It compacts slowly under weight, shifts subtly under temperature change, and holds traces of every contact it has received. Even in silence, it records interaction. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how Some winter garments used layered construction that allowed outer layers to shed moisture and wind, while inner layers remained dry and warm, creating a functional separation between environmental exposure and body heat retention. You imagine this separation now as a kind of buffer zone where the harshness of the world is absorbed before it reaches what is essential. The group makes another small adjustment, and you follow instinctively. These changes are subtle, almost invisible unless you are aware of them. A slight shift closer together, a repositioning to reduce exposed surface, a redistribution of space that prioritizes shared warmth. You realize that survival here is not a single act of endurance. It is continuous recalibration. The body is always negotiating with its surroundings, even in stillness. Your breathing becomes more noticeable again as attention turns inward. Each inhale feels measured. Each exhale is a small release of warmth into an environment that immediately absorbs it. You begin to understand how fragile the balance is between energy and loss. Historians still debate how much indigenous cold weather adaptation relied on conscious thermoregulation knowledge versus embodied habit. Some argue that people developed intuitive understanding of how movement, posture, and layering influenced heat retention. Others suggest that these practices were culturally transmitted without explicit physiological framing. You shift slightly again, feeling how the ground responds beneath layered snow. Is firm but not solid in the way stone is. It behaves like a structured medium compressing under pressure while still holding insulating air pockets within it. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulation strategies often relied on trapping still air between layers of organic material, since still air significantly reduces heat transfer compared to moving air or direct contact with frozen surfaces. You imagine these invisible air pockets now surrounding you like a quiet barrier that slows the escape of warmth. Wind moves faintly above the sheltered terrain, but it does not fully enter this space. You are aware of it as presence rather than force. It exists overhead, shaping temperature indirectly, but no longer striking directly against your body. The group remains coordinated without words. Small movements occur in silence. Adjustments of posture, slight repositioning of limbs, subtle changes in orientation to minimize exposure. These are continuous, almost automatic behaviors now. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically loosening and tightening clothing layers during long winter nights to regulate moisture and prevent internal dampness from reducing insulation efficiency. Even small adjustments could significantly impact comfort and safety. You begin to see how survival here is not just about resisting cold, but about managing internal conditions as carefully as external ones. The sky above remains clear, but it feels less relevant now. Your attention is fully grounded in immediate experience. Temperature shifts, wind behavior, body response, spatial arrangement. These form the true landscape of survival. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with subtle activity. Snow settling in slow increments, fabric shifting softly, distant branches creaking under frozen load. Each sound is faint but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not dramatic, but it is constant. A cycle of adjustment, conservation awareness, and repetition that defines every moment of existence in this environment. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered space, you understand more clearly that survival here is not a single achievement. It is a continuous process of alignment with conditions that never stop changing, even when they appear still. You begin this section with a quieter kind of awareness where even thought feels slightly slowed by the cold. It is not discomfort alone that shapes your perception now, but adaptation. Your mind begins to filter reality differently, focusing only on what directly affects survival in the moment. The group remains in place within the sheltered terrain, and the night has deepened further. Movement is minimal, but awareness is not. You sense that everyone is still engaged even in stillness. Attention is distributed, shared, and continuous in subtle ways. Fire remains present in your imagination as a stabilizing force. Even when not visible, it defines structure. It determines spacing, rhythm, and behavior. It is no longer just heat. It is organization against entropy. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival practices often relied on careful site selection based on wind direction patterns. Camps were frequently placed in areas where natural landforms disrupted prevailing winds, reducing exposure and creating microclimates that could be significantly less severe than surrounding open terrain. You begin to feel this principle again as the sheltered space holds steady. The wind is not gone, but it is fragmented. It moves above, around, and beyond rather than directly through. That difference continues to define your experience of cold. Snow here is stable but not inert. It holds structure shaped by earlier forces. You notice how it forms gentle ridges and depressions that reflect past wind patterns. Even in stillness, the environment carries memory of movement. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some groups would use natural snow formations as part of their shelter design, reinforcing existing drifts rather than constructing entirely new barriers, effectively using the landscape's own accumulation patterns as structural support. You imagine shaping shelter not by building against the environment but by collaborating with it, guiding what already exists. The group shifts again in near silence. These movements are barely perceptible unless you are paying close attention. A slight repositioning of bodies, a tightening of shared space, a subtle reduction of exposed edges to wind flow. You begin to notice how your own body mirrors these changes without instruction. Stillness is not fixed, it is responsive. Even rest is an ongoing adjustment process. Your breathing remains steady, but it feels more intentional now. Each inhale draws in cold air that must be warmed internally. Each exhale releases heat into an environment that immediately absorbs it. This exchange becomes increasingly noticeable the longer you remain still. Historians still debate how much indigenous cold weather adaptation involved formal understanding of environmental physics versus experiential knowledge passed through her practice. Some argue that knowledge was encoded in behavior rather than explanation, allowing survival principles to be learned through repetition and observation. You adjust your position slightly again, feeling how snow compresses beneath weight. It does not behave like solid ground nor like empty space. It exists as a medium between states capable of both supporting and absorbing. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulating sleeping arrangements often relied on layered organic materials arranged to trap air pockets, since still air reduces heat transfer far more effectively than compacted or moving air. You begin to recognize that air itself is part of the shelter. Not just structure, but trapped stillness. Wind passes faintly above again, but their presence is reduced here. You are no longer directly engaged with it. Instead, you experience its absence of impact, which becomes its own form of protection. The group remains coordinated through silence. Small, nearly invisible adjustments continue. A shift of weight, a repositioning of limbs, a tightening of shared proximity. These actions are constant but restrained. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves maintaining periodic micromovement even during rest to sustain circulation in extremities and prevent localized cooling injuries during prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. You begin to understand that stillness here is carefully managed, not absolute. Even in rest, the body must remain slightly active. The sky above remains open and unchanged, but it feels distant now. Your awareness is anchored in immediate space. Ground texture, air movement, body position, group proximity. These define your reality more than anything above. Silence deepens again, but it is structured by subtle continuous activity. Snow settling slowly, fabric shifting faintly. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under load. Each sound is faint but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steady and unbroken. It is not marked by events but by continuous adjustment, a cycle of observation, conservation, and recalibration that persists without pause. And as the night continues through this quiet sheltered geography, you begin to understand more clearly that survival here is not about resisting the environment, but about integrating with its patterns so completely that even cold becomes something you move with rather than against. You begin this section with a deeper sense of rhythm settling into your awareness, as if the night itself has become structured into repeating breaths of cold and stillness. It is no longer unpredictable in the same way. Instead, it feels patterned, almost cyclical, as though even the wind follows an unseen schedule. The group remains within the sheltered geography, and movement is now minimal and deliberate. You sense that energy conservation has become the guiding principle of every action. Nothing is wasted, not motion, not breath, not attention. Fire continues to exist in your mind as a quiet, organizing presence. Even without seeing it, you understand its role as a temporal anchor. It marks phases of the night, defines rotations of rest, and shapes how the group mentally divides time in an environment where darkness lasts far longer than light. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often incorporated careful resource planning for extended cold seasons, including food storage strategies that ensured sustained energy availability during periods when hunting conditions were limited or unpredictable. You begin to feel how this principle extends beyond food. It becomes a mindset of anticipation. Everything is prepared in advance of need. Nothing is left to chance when survival depends on stability over time rather than immediate response. The snow around you remains quiet, but its structure feels more significant the longer you observe it. It is not simply frozen water. It is layered history of wind temperature shifts and compression events. Each layer reflects a moment in time preserved in physical form. A quirky detail recorded in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter groups carefully tracked animal movement patterns during early winter to estimate food availability for the coming months, adjusting hunting strategies based on subtle changes in migration timing and behavior. You imagine this careful observation now, where survival depends not only on present conditions, but on reading future implications hidden in current behavior. The group shifts slightly again, and you follow the movement instinctively. The adjustment is small but purposeful. Bodies align to reduce exposure, redistribute warmth, and maintain shared protection. Even in sense, coordination remains constant. You begin to notice how your perception of cold has changed. It is no longer just intensity, it has texture. Some moments feel sharp and immediate, while others feel slow and lingering, as if the cold itself has different layers of behavior. Your breathing remains steady, but increasingly deliberate. Each inhale is measured against energy cost. Each exhale becomes a controlled release into an environment that does not return warmth. Conservation becomes instinctive. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was formalized through structured seasonal planning versus transmitted through lived experience. Some argue that communities developed complex anticipatory systems based on long-term environmental familiarity. Others emphasize adaptability and real-time decision-making as the primary survival mechanism. You crouch slightly, feeling how the snow beneath you resists differently depending on depth. The upper layer is firm and cold. Beneath it, there is a softer structure that compresses slowly under pressure. This layered response creates both challenge and opportunity in movement and rest. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often relied on careful energy budgeting, where physical exertion was balanced against food intake and environmental exposure to prevent exhaustion during prolonged cold periods. You begin to understand survival here as arithmetic. Every movement has cost, every pause has value. Every decision is measured in energy retained or lost. Wind passes above again, but it is distant and fragmented. It no longer defines your immediate experience. Instead, it becomes background condition, something acknowledged but not directly engaged. The group remains steady, with only subtle adjustments continuing. A shift in posture, a slight tightening of clothing, a repositioning to reduce exposed surface area. These actions continue without interruption, forming a quiet system of shared maintenance. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves planning movement routes during winter conditions based on expected wind exposure zones, allowing groups to conserve energy by avoiding high-resistance paths even if they were shorter in distance. You begin to see terrain as resistance rather than distance. The easiest path is not the shortest, but the least demanding in energy expenditure. The sky above remains open and unchanged, but your attention is fully grounded in immediate space. Ground texture, air movement, body pull, position, group spacing. These define the real structure of survival experience. Silence deepens again, but it is layered with subtle activity. Snow settling into minute shifts, fabric moving faintly with breath. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under accumulated weight. Each sound is faint but meaningful in its scarcity. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steady and uninterrupted. It is not dramatic or sudden. It is cumulative, built from countless small adjustments that never fully stop. And as the night continues through this sheltered geography, you begin to understand more clearly that survival here is not defined by strength alone, but by sustained awareness of energy, environment, and timing, woven together into a continuous practice of living within limits rather than resisting them. You begin this section with a quieter realization that the night has fully taken over now, not as an event, but as a condition that shapes everything you perceive. It is no longer something you are moving through. It is something you are fully inside of, like a second environment layered over the physical world. The group remains settled within the sheltered terrain, and movement is now rare and highly intentional. You sense that the priority has shifted from adaptation to preservation. Everything is about maintaining the fragile balance already achieved against the surrounding cold. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a stabilizing concept. Even when absent, it organizes the mental map of survival. You imagine its position, its influence, its role in drawing people together, and structuring the night into manageable segments of time and attention. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often included the use of communal structures or shared temporary lodges, where combined body heat significantly improved internal temperature stability compared to isolated exposure in open winter environments. You begin to feel this logic in your awareness of proximity. Space is no longer neutral. Distance equals heat loss. Closeness equals preservation. The arrangement of bodies becomes a form of environmental control rather than simple social behavior. The snow around you remains steady, but it feels increasingly like a medium rather than a surface. It holds cold but also shapes insulation. It responds to pressure, trapping air in ways that influence temperature at a micro level. You begin to see it as part of the shelter system rather than something outside it. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter shelters were constructed with semi-enclosed communal designs that allowed heat to circulate while still maintaining controlled airflow, preventing suffocation while maximizing warmth retention from shared body heat and internal fire sources. You imagine this enclosed warmth now not sealed but balanced, allowing survival conditions to persist without trapping danger. The group makes another small adjustment and you follow almost unconsciously. The movement is minimal but meaningful. A shift in orientation, a tightening of shared space, a reduction of exposure to faint wind currents that still move above the terrain. You notice how your body has become more efficient in its responses. Movements are smaller now. Energy is conserved more deliberately. Even thought feels slightly slower, as if the cold encourages reduction in unnecessary activity. Your breathing remains steady but increasingly measured. Each inhale is controlled. Each exhale is minimized in visible vapor loss. You begin to understand how even respiration becomes part of survival strategy in extreme cold environments. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was consciously structured versus organically developed through lived repetition. Some argue that survival practices were embedded in cultural routines that reinforced environmental awareness without formal explanation. Others suggest more intentional systems of seasonal planning and resource optimization. You shift slightly again, feeling how the ground beneath you responds with layered resistance. It is no longer just snow, it is compressed structure with varying densities each layer, reflecting different environmental conditions over time. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often relied on maintaining a balance between activity and stillness, ensuring that bodies generated enough heat through minimal movement without expending excessive energy reserves required for long-term survival. You begin to understand that movement itself is a form of fuel consumption. Even small actions must be justified by necessity. Wind passes above again, but it feels distant now, almost abstract. You are no longer directly reacting to it. Instead, you are operating within a space that has already been shaped to reduce its impact. The group remains coordinated without speech. Subtle adjustments continue, a slight shift in posture, a closer alignment of bodies, a redistribution of space to minimize exposed surfaces. These actions are continuous but restrained. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically exchanging positions within sleeping arrangements to ensure that no single individual remains continuously exposed to outer cold zones, allowing heat distribution to remain more equitable across the group. You begin to see survival here as a shared system of thermal management. Heat is not owned individually, it is circulated, shared, and protected collectively. The sky above remains vast, but it feels increasingly distant in relevance. Your focus remains anchored to immediate conditions. Ground stability, air movement, body heat, proximity, and timing define your reality more than anything in the upper atmosphere. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with subtle, continuous processes. Snow settling slowly under its own weight, fabric shifting faintly with breath and micro-movement. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under accumulated stress. Each sound is minimal but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not a sequence of events, but a sustained condition of careful maintenance. A continuous balancing act between energy exposure and protection. And as the night continues through this sheltered space, you begin to understand more clearly that survival here is not a matter of resisting the cold, but of integrating into its structure so completely that every adjustment becomes part of a larger, ongoing system of living within limits. You begin this section with a deeper sense of stillness settling over everything, as if even the landscape has reduced its effort to move. The night feels heavier now, not in sound or sight, but in presence. It is as though the cold itself has become more concentrated, less scattered, more absolute. The group remains within the sheltered terrain, and movement is now almost entirely reduced to necessity. You sense that energy is being preserved with increasing care. Every motion is evaluated before it is made, even when that evaluation happens unconsciously. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a quiet organizing principle. Even when not present, it defines behavior. You imagine how its warmth would dictate spacing, posture, and the slow rotation of attention through the night. It remains a reference point for survival logic. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often integrated careful use of animal resources beyond food, including hides and rendered fats, which provided both insulation and protection against moisture and wind exposure in extreme cold environments. You begin to feel this principle in your awareness of protection layers. Survival is not only about blocking cold, it is about managing how cold interacts with surfaces, how moisture moves, how wind penetrates or is deflected. The snow around you remains quiet, but it feels increasingly structured. You notice how it forms uneven ridges shaped by earlier wind activity now frozen into place. These shapes are not random. They are records of movement preserved in stillness. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how rendered animal fat was sometimes applied not only to skin and clothing but also to tool handles and equipment surfaces, reducing the risk of freezing adhesion and improving usability in extreme winter conditions. You imagine this thin protective layer now altering how materials interact with cold air, reducing friction between life and freezing conditions. The group shifts again in near silence. The movement is minimal but coordinated. A slight adjustment in proximity, a subtle reorientation to reduce exposure pathways. You begin to notice how even in rest spatial arrangement remains an active survival tool. Your awareness of your own body becomes more refined. Temperature differences across skin surface become noticeable in a way they would not be in warmer environments. One side feels slightly more exposed, the other more protected. You instinctively adjust without needing instruction. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge included explicit environmental physics understanding versus deeply embodied observational skill. Some scholars emphasize practical experimentation refined over generations. Others argue for structured ecological knowledge systems embedded within cultural practice and oral tradition. You shift again, feeling how snow beneath you compresses further under sustained weight. It is no longer simply a surface. It is a layered structure that responds slowly to pressure redistributing force through trapped air pockets and compacted crystals. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulating materials were often arranged in multiple alternating layers, combining coarse and fine textures to trap air and reduce conductive heat transfer between body and frozen ground. You begin to understand that insulation is not a barrier alone. It is a system of controlled emptiness where trapped air becomes as important as solid material. Wind moves faintly above the terrain again, but it no longer feels immediate. It is present as a distant condition rather than an active force. You exist within a pocket of reduced interaction shaped by geography and accumulation of snow and rock. The group remains steady with subtle adjustments continuing. A slight tightening of clothing, a repositioning of limbs, a small shift in orientation. These movements are nearly invisible but constant, forming a quiet rhythm of maintenance. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodic assessment of body heat distribution during long winter nights, with individuals adjusting posture or position to prevent prolonged exposure of any single area to cold surfaces or wind channels. You begin to see survival here as continuous self-monitoring, not dramatic awareness but steady low-level calibration of body and environment. The sky above remains open, but it feels less relevant now. Your focus is anchored entirely in immediate conditions. Ground texture, air density, proximity, and internal warmth regulation define your experience more than anything distant or external. Silence deepens again, but it is not empty. It is filled with faint, persistent processes. Snow settling in microscopic shifts, fabric moving softly with breath, occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under accumulated pressure. Each sound is subtle but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing, uninterrupted and steady. It is not a sequence of actions, but a sustained condition of balance between loss and conservation. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered space, you begin to understand more clearly that survival here is not achieved through resistance, but through continuous alignment with a world that demands constant adjustment, where even stillness must be actively maintained. You begin this section with a subtle shift in awareness, as if the night has moved into its deepest layer. Everything feels slower now, not because time has changed, but because your perception of it has adjusted. The cold is no longer surprising. It is simply present, steady and absolute. The group remains in place within the sheltered terrain, and movement has become extremely minimal. You sense that the body has entered a conservation state where every action is weighed against the cost of energy loss. Even thought feels more selective, focusing only on immediate necessity. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a stabilizing reference point. It is no longer something you think about directly, but something that organizes the structure of survival around it. It defines spacing, rotation, and the rhythm of shared endurance through the night. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often involved careful management of heat retention through both environmental design and behavioral adaptation, including the strategic use of terrain materials and group positioning to reduce exposure during long cold periods. You begin to feel how deeply this principle extends into every aspect of the scene. Nothing exists in isolation. Shelter body movement and environment are all interconnected parts of a single survival system. The snow around you remains still, but its presence feels more complex now. It is not just cold material beneath you. It is a layered structure that influences temperature, sound, and even perception of space. It absorbs noise, softens movement, and stabilizes temperature fluctuations near the ground. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter groups recognized that compacted snow beneath repeated use could form more stable insulating layers over time, effectively improving the thermal efficiency of frequently used resting areas. You imagine this gradual transformation now, where repeated presence reshapes the ground into something more supportive, almost like the land itself adapting to human survival patterns. The group shifts slightly again with nearly imperceptible coordination. A small adjustment in spacing, a subtle change in orientation. These movements are not random. They are part of a continuous effort to manage exposure and preserve shared warmth. You notice your own body responding in similar ways. Stillness is no longer passive. It is active regulation. Even the smallest adjustments feel meaningful, as if the body has learned to interpret cold as a continuous instruction rather than a static condition. Your breathing remains steady, but increasingly economical. Each inhale is measured. Each exhale is controlled. You begin to understand how moisture loss becomes as critical as heat loss in extreme cold environments, shaping how respiration itself must be managed. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was formally structured versus transmitted through embodied repetition and cultural practice. Some scholars emphasize adaptive learning through lived experience, while others highlight long-standing systems of ecological knowledge passed across generations. You shift again, feeling how the snow beneath you compresses further over time. It is no longer just a surface. It's a dynamic medium that responds slowly to pressure and temperature, reshaping itself around bodies and movement. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulating strategies often relied on creating multi-layered barriers that trapped still air between materials, since still air significantly reduces conductive heat transfer compared to dense or moving mediums. You begin to recognize that insulation is not simply about blocking cold. It is about controlling what moves and what remains still. Wind passes above again, but it is distant and fragmented. It no longer defines your immediate experience. Instead, it exists as background condition acknowledged but not directly engaged. The group remains coordinated without speech. Subtle adjustments continue in silence, a slight shift in posture, a tightening of shared space, a small redistribution of bodies to minimize exposure to wind channels. These actions are continuous but restrained. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically checking extremity warmth during long winter nights, ensuring that fingers and toes remain viable through subtle movement and repositioning to maintain circulation. You begin to understand that even stillness must remain flexible. Absolute immobility becomes a risk in itself. The sky above remains vast, but your attention is no longer drawn to it. Your awareness is fully grounded in immediate conditions. Temperature gradients, body positioning, air movement, and shared proximity define your reality. Silence deepens again, but it is layered with faint activity. Snow settling in slow increments. Fabric shifting softly with breath. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under pressure. Each sound is minimal but meaningful in its scarcity. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not a series of events, but a sustained condition of careful maintenance, where survival depends on continuous, nearly invisible adjustments. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered geography, You begin to understand more clearly that survival here is not about overcoming the cold, but about learning to exist within its structure so completely that every movement becomes part of its ongoing balance. You begin this section with a quieter, deeper awareness of how little separates comfort from danger in this frozen world. The difference is not dramatic. It is measured in small shifts of wind, slight changes in posture, and the continuous management of body heat over time. The group remains within the sheltered terrain and the night feels increasingly still. Not because the world has stopped moving, but because everything has slowed into a stable pattern. You sense that survival now depends less on action and more on maintenance of what has already been carefully established. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a central organizing idea. Even when absent, it shapes how you imagine the space. It determines where attention would gather, how bodies would orient, and how the night would be divided into cycles of watchfulness and rest. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often required careful management of fuel resources, ensuring that firewood collection, storage, and usage were balanced against long-term seasonal demands in environments where energy sources were limited and difficult to replace. You begin to feel this principle as part of a larger logic of conservation. Everything is finite. Everything must be allocated carefully. Energy, heat, movement, attention. Nothing is infinite in this environment, and nothing can be wasted. The snow around you remains quiet, but it feels increasingly structured in your perception. It's not just a covering. It is a system that interacts with temperature, wind, and movement. It shapes insulation zones and influences how heat is retained or lost near the ground. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter camps relied on carefully selected deadwood, gathered in advance of heavy snowfalls, ensuring that fuel sources remained accessible even when deep snow made forest collection more difficult or dangerous. You imagine this foresight now where preparation is not optional but essential, and where survival depends on anticipating conditions before they arrive. The group adjusts again in near silence. The movement is minimal but purposeful, a slight shift in spacing, a subtle reorientation toward protected zones. These adjustments continue without instruction, forming a silent system of shared awareness. You notice your own body responding in similar ways. Stillness is no longer passive, it is a regulated condition. Even small changes in posture carry meaning, adjusting heat retention and exposure simultaneously. Your breathing remains steady, but increasingly conservative. Each inhale is controlled, drawing in cold air that must be warmed internally. Each exhale releases heat into an environment that does not return it. This exchange becomes increasingly noticeable over time. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was formally structured versus transmitted through lived experience and cultural repetition. Some argue that survival skills were deeply embedded in daily routines, while others emphasize intentional ecological knowledge systems passed through oral tradition and seasonal practice. You shift slightly again, feeling how the snow beneath you continues to compact slowly under sustained pressure. It is no longer just a surface, or it is a layered structure that responds over time, gradually reshaping itself around bodies and environmental conditions. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often depended on careful monitoring of energy expenditure, ensuring that physical activity, rest, and food intake remained balanced to prevent exhaustion during prolonged cold exposure. You begin to understand survival here as a form of continuous accounting. Every action has a cost, every pause has value, every decision affects the balance between heat loss and energy preservation. Wind moves faintly above the rocks again, but it feels distant and fragmented. It no longer dominates perception. Instead, it exists as a background condition that is acknowledged but not directly engaged. The group remains coordinated through silence. Subtle adjustments continue. A slight shift of posture, a tightening of shared space, a small repositioning to reduce exposed surfaces. These actions are continuous and nearly invisible. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodic rotation of individuals within sheltered group arrangements, ensuring that no single person remains consistently exposed to outer edges where wind and cold are most intense. You begin to see survival here as a shared system of thermal balance, where protection is distributed across the group rather than concentrated in one place or one person. The sky above remains vast and unchanged, but your attention is now entirely grounded in immediate experience. Ground texture, air movement, body heat, proximity and timing define the structure of your awareness. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with subtle, continuous processes. Snow settling slowly under its own weight, fabric shifting faintly with breath, occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under accumulated stress. Each sound is minimal, but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steadily without interruption. It is not a sequence of events, but a continuous practice of maintenance and adjustment, where survival depends on constant alignment with changing conditions. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered geography, you understand more clearly that survival here is not about resisting the cold, but about distributing its impact across time, space, and people so that no single moment becomes overwhelming. You begin this section with the sense that the night has become less about observation and more about endurance itself. The act of noticing is still present, but it has narrowed. Your awareness now focuses only on what immediately affects warmth balance and survival within the next few moments. The group remains within the sheltered terrain and stillness dominates. Movement is rare and efficient, occurring only when necessary to maintain comfort or reduce exposure. You sense that the entire system has shifted into long-duration preservation, where time is measured by stability rather than change. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a central but distant idea. Even without flame, it structures how you think about safety. It defines where warmth would concentrate, how bodies would orient, and how attention would circulate through the group during the night. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often relied on careful observation of weather patterns, such as cloud movement, wind shifts, and atmospheric stillness, to anticipate incoming storms or temperature drops before they became immediately visible in local conditions. You begin to notice how this principle feels relevant even in this quiet moment. The environment is not truly static. It is constantly preparing even when nothing appears to be happening. The stillness itself is part of a larger process. The snow around you remains unchanged at first glance, but your perception of it has deepened. It is no longer a uniform surface. It is a layered system shaped by compression, wind, and temperature variation. Each section of ground carries different thermal properties depending on its structure. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter groups were able to interpret subtle differences in snow texture and hardness to determine whether ground beneath was stable, frozen deeply, or affected by underlying moisture or air pockets. You imagine reading the ground in this way not visually alone, but through touch, weight, and resistance. The land becomes a form of text written in pressure and temperature. The group adjusts again in near silence. The movement is minimal but coordinated. A slight shift in spacing, a subtle reorientation toward areas of reduced wind exposure. These actions continue without instruction, forming a shared system of environmental adaptation. You notice your own body responding more efficiently now. Stillness feels more natural, but it is not passive. It is actively maintained. Even minor discomfort leads to small adjustments that improve heat retention or reduce exposure. Your breathing remains steady but increasingly regulated. Each inhale draws in cold air that must be warmed internally. Each exhale releases energy into an environment that immediately absorbs it. This exchange becomes a constant background calculation. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge relied on explicit environmental interpretation versus embodied experience. Some argue that people developed highly refined sensory awareness through constant exposure, while others emphasize structured ecological knowledge embedded in seasonal traditions. You shift slightly again, feeling how snow beneath you continues to compact gradually. It behaves less like a surface and more like a responsive medium slowly adapting to sustained pressure and body heat. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often incorporated careful timing of activity and rest cycles, ensuring that exertion occurred during periods of relative warmth or shelter availability to minimize unnecessary energy loss. You begin to understand survival here as a form of timing. Not just what you do, but when you do it determines cost and consequence. Wind passes faintly above again, but it remains distant. You no longer react to it directly. Instead, you interpret it as background structure, something that defines the limits of your environment without actively entering it. The group remains coordinated through quiet awareness. Subtle adjustments continue. A slight shift of posture, a tightening of shared arrangement, a careful redistribution of space to minimize exposure. These movements are continuous but restrained. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves monitoring group warmth distribution during extended cold exposure, ensuring that individuals periodically adjust positions to balance heat retention across the collective. You begin to see survival here as a shared system of thermal management. No single body carries the full burden alone. Heat exposure and protection are distributed across the group in continuous balance. The sky above remains vast and unchanged, but it feels increasingly irrelevant. Your awareness is anchored fully in immediate conditions. Ground structure, air movement, proximity, and internal warmth regulation define your entire perceptual world. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with subtle activity. Snow settling slowly in compressed layers. Fabric shifting faintly with breath and micro-movement. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under accumulated weight. Each sound is minimal but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steadily without interruption. It is not a sequence of events, but a continuous process of adjustment, conservation, and shared maintenance. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered space, you understand more clearly that survival here is not about overcoming the environment, but about maintaining alignment with it so precisely that even cold becomes something managed collectively rather than endured alone. You begin this section with a subtle shift in how you perceive time again. It no longer feels like something passing forward in a straight line. Instead, it feels like repeated layers of similar moments, each one slightly different in temperature, wind behavior, and bodily awareness. The group remains within the sheltered terrain and movement is now extremely minimal. You sense that the night has entered its most stable phase, where survival is no longer about adaptation in large steps, but about maintaining equilibrium through countless small adjustments. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a quiet structural idea. Even without seeing it, you understand its organizing influence. It determines spacing, rhythm, and the invisible cycles of attention that move through the group like a shared pulse. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often involved long-term, seasonal adaptation strategies, including planned mobility between resource zones to ensure access to food, fuel, and shelter materials across changing environmental conditions. You begin to feel how this principle extends beyond geography. It becomes a philosophy of movement and timing. Nothing is fixed permanently. Survival depends on knowing when to stay and when to shift even within the same landscape. The snow around you remains still, but its complexity becomes more apparent the longer you observe it. It is not a single material. It is a stratified system of ice crystals, compressed air pockets, and temperature-influenced layers that affect insulation and ground stability. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter travelers were able to identify safe travel paths by observing subtle variations in snow surface firmness, allowing them to avoid hidden weak layers or areas prone to collapse under weight. You imagine this careful reading of the ground now, where each step is informed by texture, resistance, and subtle visual cues that most people would overlook. The group adjusts again with nearly imperceptible coordination. A slight shift in position, a subtle tightening of formation. These movements are not random. They are part of a continuous effort to manage exposure and preserve shared thermal balance. You notice that your own body has become increasingly efficient in its responses. Movement is smaller now, adjustments are more precise. Even discomfort is addressed through minimal energy expenditure. Your breathing remains steady but carefully controlled. Each inhale brings in air that must be warmed internally. Each exhale releases heat into a surrounding environment that immediately absorbs it. This constant exchange becomes part of your background awareness. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was explicitly taught versus learned through immersion in environment and community practice. Some argue that ecological understanding was deeply embedded in cultural routines, while others emphasize accumulated experiential knowledge refined across generations. You shift slightly again, feeling how the snow beneath you continues to compress and adapt over time. It is no longer just ground, it is responsive structure that changes slowly under pressure and temperature variation. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often relied on careful management of rest and movement cycles, ensuring that energy expenditure was minimized during the coldest periods of night, while allowing brief activity windows for necessary adjustments. You begin to understand survival here as a rhythm of restraint. Action is not constant. It is strategically limited, distributed across time to reduce cumulative energy loss. Wind passes faintly above again, but it remains fragmented and distant. You no longer interpret it as forceful presence. Instead, it becomes environmental background shaping conditions without directly impacting your immediate space. The group remains coordinated without speech. Subtle adjustments continue, a slight shift of posture, a closer arrangement of bodies, a redistribution of exposed surfaces. These movements are continuous but almost invisible. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodic reassessment of group spacing during long winter nights, ensuring that heat retention remains optimized as environmental conditions shift subtly over time. You begin to see survival here as continuous calibration. Nothing is ever fully set. Even stable arrangements require ongoing maintenance. The sky above remains vast, but it feels increasingly detached from your focus. Your attention is grounded entirely in immediate experience. Ground texture, air density, proximity, and internal warmth, regulation define your awareness. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with faint, continuous processes. Snow settling in slow compression. Fabric shifting softly with breath. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under sustained stress. Each sound is minimal but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not a sequence of events but a continuous balancing process, where survival depends on constant micro-adjustments that maintain equilibrium between heat loss and conservation. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered geography, you understand more clearly that survival here is not about resisting the cold, but about continuously adapting to its low pressure until it becomes part of the system you are moving within. You begin this section with a sense that the night has lost any remaining sense of urgency. What remains is not tension, but continuity. The cold is still present, but it no longer feels like something arriving or intensifying. It feels like something sustained, steady, and fully integrated into the environment around you. The group remains within the sheltered terrain, and movement is now almost entirely reduced to essential adjustments. You sense that the body has adapted into a conservation rhythm, where even thought and attention feel more selective, filtering out anything unnecessary. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a conceptual center of organization. Even without flame, it shapes how you imagine human presence in the cold. It defines gathering rotation rest cycles and the invisible structure of shared survival throughout the night. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems were deeply embedded in broader seasonal lifeways where knowledge of land climate and resource availability was transmitted through lived practice storytelling and repeated communal experience across generations. You begin to feel how this continuity shapes everything you've been observing. Survival here is not a reaction, it is inheritance. A set of practices refined slowly over time, carried forward through repetition and adaptation. The snow around you remains still, but it now feels almost like a record of everything that has passed through it. Wind pressure, temperature shifts movement. All of it is stored in subtle layers that influence how it behaves now under your presence. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter groups could recognize subtle seasonal changes by examining how snow accumulated on familiar landmarks using these patterns to track shifts in prevailing winds and weather cycles over time. You imagine this song familiarity now where the land is not only known visually, but understood through repeated seasonal memory, forming a relationship between people and an environment that deepens with each passing year. The group shifts again in silence. The movement is minimal but coordinated. A slight repositioning, a careful adjustment of spacing. These actions continue without instruction, forming a shared system of awareness and response. You notice how your own body has settled into this rhythm more completely now. Stillness feels more natural, but it is not passive. It is actively maintained through constant micro-adjustments that preserve warmth and reduce exposure. Your breathing remains steady, but it feels increasingly integrated into the surrounding environment. Each inhale is measured. Each exhale becomes part of the cold air that immediately absorbs warmth and disperses it into the night. Historians still debate how much Indigenous winter survival knowledge was explicitly formalized versus embedded in cultural practice and environmental immersion. Some emphasize structured ecological understanding, while others highlight the role of lived experience and continuous adaptation. You shift slightly again, feeling how the snow beneath you continues to compress slowly over time. It behaves less like inert ground and more like a living structure shaped by repeated pressure and environmental conditions. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often relied on long-term familiarity with specific landscapes, allowing individuals to recognize subtle environmental changes that signaled shifts in weather resource availability or safety conditions. You begin to understand survival here as relationship. Not just interaction with environment, but sustained familiarity that deepens understanding over time. Wind passes faintly above again, but it remains distant and fragmented. It no longer dominates perception. Instead, it exists as a background condition that defines the boundaries of experience without directly entering it. The group remains coordinated without speech. Subtle adjustments continue, a slight shift in posture, a tightening of shared formation, a redistribution of space to reduce exposure. These actions are continuous but nearly invisible. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves maintaining periodic awareness of group thermal balance, ensuring that no single individual becomes overly exposed or isolated from shared warmth during extended cold periods. You begin to see survival here as collective continuity. Warmth is not individual. It is shared, maintained, and distributed across the group through constant attention and adjustment. The sky above remains vast, but it feels increasingly distant in relevance. Your awareness is fully grounded in immediate conditions. Ground structure, air movement, proximity, and internal regulation define your entire perceptual field. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with subtle ongoing processes. Snow settling in slow layers, fabric shifting faintly with breath, occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under sustained load. Each sound is minimal but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steadily without interruption. It is not a sequence of events, but a continuous state of adaptation, where survival depends on maintaining alignment with a constantly changing environment. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered geography, You understand more clearly that survival here is not about overcoming the cold, but about living within a long-term relationship with it, shaped by memory, repetition, and shared awareness across time. You begin this section with a quieter awareness that the night is no longer something you are moving through, but something you are being held within. The cold does not feel closer or stronger. It feels settled, like a permanent condition that has removed the idea of change. The group remains within the sheltered terrain, and movement is now extremely limited. You sense that the body has fully entered a preservation state where energy use is minimized to only what is necessary to maintain warmth and circulation. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a structural idea rather than a physical presence. It organizes space in your imagination, shaping how you understand gathering, protection, and shared survival even in its absence. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often emphasize spatial awareness in shelter use, where positioning within a shared space influenced exposure levels, warmth retention, and overall thermal balance during long cold nights. You begin to feel how this principle shapes everything around you. Position is not neutral. Where you are placed in relation to others and to wind exposure determines how much energy you lose over time. The snow around you remains still, but it now feels almost engineered in your perception. It is not random accumulation. It is structured by wind, history, temperature cycles, and repeated compression. It forms a silent map of environmental behavior. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some winter travelers use familiar snowdrift formations as navigational markers, recognizing recurring patterns in how wind shaped the landscape from season to season. You imagine this familiarity now, where even frozen terrain becomes a form of memory, allowing movement and survival decisions to be guided by recognition rather than uncertainty. The group shifts again in near silence. The movement is minimal but precise, a slight change in spacing, a careful adjustment of posture. These actions are continuous and coordinated without verbal instruction. You notice that your own body has become highly responsive to these subtle environmental cues. Stillness is not absence of movement. It is continuous micro-regulation. Every adjustment serves a purpose, even if it is barely noticeable. Your breathing remains steady but increasingly conservative. Each inhale is measured. Each exhale releases warmth into an environment that immediately absorbs it. This exchange becomes a constant background process of loss and management. Historians still debate how much indigenous winter survival knowledge was formally structured versus developed through long-term environmental immersion. Some emphasize the role of cultural transmission, while others highlight direct experiential learning, shaped by repeated exposure to seasonal conditions. You shift slightly again, feeling how the snow beneath you has become more compact over time. It behaves like a responsive medium, slowly adapting to sustained pressure and temperature changes. Another observation from historical sources describes how winter survival systems often relied on careful awareness of microclimates, where small variations in terrain could create significantly different thermal conditions within very short distances. You begin to understand survival here as spatial precision. Small differences in location can determine large differences in energy loss and exposure. Wind passes faintly above again, but it remains distant and fragmented. It no longer feels like an active force. Instead, it becomes a boundary condition shaping the limits of your environment without directly entering it. The group remains coordinated through silence. Subtle adjustments continue, a slight shift of weight, a tightening of shared formation, a redistribution of spacing to minimize exposed surfaces. These actions are continuous and nearly imperceptible. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodically reassessing individual positioning within group arrangements to ensure balanced exposure and shared thermal protection throughout extended winter nights. You begin to see survival here as a system of continuous spatial management where every position carries consequences for heat retention and energy conservation. The sky above remains vast, but it feels increasingly irrelevant. Your attention is fully anchored in immediate conditions. Ground texture, air movement, body proximity, and internal regulation define your entire experience. Silence deepens again, but it is filled with faint continuous processes. Snow settling slowly under accumulated weight. Fabric shifting softly with breath. Occasional distant creaks from frozen branches under environmental stress. Each sound is minimal but meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not a sequence of events, but a sustained condition of careful adjustment, where survival depends on maintaining balance between loss and conservation across time. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered geography, you understand more clearly that survival here is not about resisting the cold, but about continuously positioning yourself within it so precisely that even exposure becomes something managed rather than endured. You begin this section with a heightened awareness of the silence that surrounds you. It is no longer simply absence of sound, but a presence in itself, shaping perception and attention. Every small noise feels amplified yet contained, as if the night itself listens and responds to each subtle movement. The group remains within the sheltered terrain, their position stable, almost statuesque. Movement is minimal, reserved only for the essential micro-adjustments needed to maintain warmth and balance. Even small shifts are deliberate, calculated against energy conservation. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a conceptual anchor. It defines space rhythm and the distribution of attention even when its flame is unseen. Its imagined warmth influences posture clustering and the subtle rotations of observation that maintain group awareness. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often relied on shared vigilance during long nights with rotations of watchfulness, ensuring that no individual bore the full burden of exposure, and that resources, such as fire and food, were continuously monitored. You begin to sense this shared responsibility as you watch the group. Even stillness becomes collective action, where attention and energy are pooled, distributed, and managed. The snow around you remains largely undisturbed, but it carries subtle traces of previous movement and wind patterns. These layered signals guide your perception of stability and hazard. Even in apparent stillness, the landscape communicates information about conditions ahead. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how early winter travellers sometimes used the distinct sound of snow compressing under weight to detect hidden ice layers or shifts in snow density, allowing them to avoid unsafe footing in low visibility conditions. You imagine this careful listening now, each step measured, each sound interpreted, revealing information invisible to the eye alone. The group shifts again, nearly imperceptibly. A minor adjustment in spacing, a subtle shift in alignment. These micro-movements reduce exposure, maintain shared warmth, and conserve energy without interrupting the stillness of the night. You notice how your own body has internalized this rhythm. Stillness is active rather than passive, maintained through continuous, nearly invisible micro-adjustments that conserve heat while avoiding exhaustion. Your breathing remains steady but regulated. Each inhale is drawn deliberately, minimizing heat loss, while each exhale releases warmth cautiously into the cold environment. The body becomes a finely tuned system of energy management. Historians still debate the extent to which indigenous winter survival knowledge relied on formal teaching versus learned practice. Some scholars emphasize structured ecological knowledge passed through oral tradition, while others highlight the embodied learning that emerges from continuous exposure and observation. You shift slightly again, sensing how snow beneath you behaves like a responsive medium. Layers compress under weight, trap still air, and influence local temperature retention, forming an invisible but crucial component of shelter. Another observation from historical sources describes how groups would carefully choose micro-locations within a camp for sleep and rest, maximizing thermal advantage by combining terrain features, snow structure, and wind shelter. You begin to see that survival is not only about preparation, but about the precision of positioning, where even small differences in location can dramatically affect exposure and heat retention. Wind passes above again faintly and intermittently, but it is no longer an immediate threat. It exists as a background parameter shaping the environment without fully penetrating the protected space. The group remains coordinated through silence. Subtle adjustments continue. A slight posture shift, a tightening of proximity, micro repositioning to minimize exposed surfaces. These actions persist quietly, forming an ongoing system of thermal equilibrium. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves subtle group spacing adjustments that are repeated at intervals to ensure even distribution of warmth and to prevent prolonged exposure of any single individual to outer colder edges. You begin to understand that survival here is not about individual endurance, but about collective adaptation where the environment, bodies and positioning interact as a continuous system. The sky above remains vast, yet your focus is entirely grounded in immediate conditions. Texture of snow air currents, body positioning, and group proximity define the landscape of survival more than anything distant. Silence deepens further, layered with subtle ongoing activity. Snow settling slowly, fabric moving gently with breath, distant creaks of frozen branches adjusting to weight. Each sound is quiet yet meaningful, shaping perception and attention. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing steadily uninterrupted. It is not a chain of events, but a continuous state of careful adaptation and monitoring where survival depends on maintaining alignment with the surrounding cold environment. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered space, you begin to understand more fully that survival here is about integrating with the cold, moving and resting within its structure, rather than confronting or resisting it directly. You begin this section with a deepened awareness that the night is nearing its longest, coldest stretch. The silence around you has intensified, yet it is not empty. It is layered with subtle textures of sound and stillness, each carrying meaning if you know how to perceive it. Even the faintest snow shift or rustle of clothing becomes information. The group remains in the sheltered terrain, and their movements are almost imperceptible now. Energy conservation dominates every action. Each micro-adjustment, each subtle repositioning is made with careful attention to preserving warmth and balance. Even thought seems to slow, aligning with the rhythm of the cold. Fire continues to exist in your awareness as a quiet structural force. It is no longer about immediate warmth or light, but about organization and coordination. Its imagined presence dictates how bodies cluster, how attention rotates, and how cycles of watchfulness continue in silent harmony. A mainstream archaeological understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival often relied on careful layering of clothing and bedding, combining hides, furs, and plant materials to create multiple insulating layers. These systems were designed to trap still air, regulate temperature, and reduce heat loss during prolonged exposure. You begin to feel the logic of this layered system. Each layer interacts with others, distributing warmth, minimizing exposure and ensuring that no single part of the body becomes dangerously cold. Survival here is about accumulation, not single acts of resistance. The snow around you is quiet, but it holds an intricate structure. Each layer reflects prior wind temperature and pressure events. Beneath the top crust, pockets of trapped air create subtle insulation. Even slight depressions or ridges are meaningful, influencing warmth and exposure. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how some groups would place small branches or sticks in the snow to indicate favorable sleeping positions or safe walking paths. These markers helped maintain spatial organization and safety in low visibility conditions. You imagine these small markers, now simple yet critical. In this environment, minor tools and signals can have outsized importance. The group shifts again with minimal but deliberate adjustments. A slight change in posture, a minor repositioning, a careful alteration of spacing. Even these quiet movements serve a collective purpose, balancing shared warmth and exposure. Your own body has internalized this rhythm. Stillness is active maintained through micro-adjustments that conserve energy and regulate temperature. Even small muscle contractions serve survival, sustaining circulation and minimizing heat loss. Your breathing remains steady and controlled. Each inhale draws in cold air that must be warmed internally, while each exhale releases energy carefully into the environment. This continual balancing act becomes a background process, almost unnoticed but essential. Historians still debate the extent to which indigenous winter survival knowledge was formalized versus embedded in experiential and cultural practice. Some suggest it was largely intuitive, honed through repeated exposure and observation. Others argue for structured teachings embedded in stories and seasonal routines, providing explicit guidance for life in extreme cold. You shift slightly again, feeling how snow beneath you continues to compress under your weight. It behaves like a responsive medium, subtly adapting to pressure and forming layers that trap air, regulate temperature, and provide minimal cushioning. Another observation from historical sources describes how group positioning within shelters was optimized based on airflow, snow cover, and thermal mapping, ensuring that no individual bore disproportionate exposure to wind or cold surfaces over extended periods. You begin to see survival as collective spatial management. Even minor changes in orientation, posture, or proximity carry significant consequences for heat retention and energy preservation. Wind passes faintly above the sheltered area, fragmented and distant. It no longer imposes itself directly, but its influence on snow and air temperature remains evident. You sense it more as a parameter than a threat. The group remains coordinated in settlement, maintaining subtle adjustments that continue the shared system of survival. Slight shifts, gentle repositioning, and careful distribution of space sustain warmth and protect against exposure without disrupting the equilibrium. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves adjusting positions within the group periodically throughout the night to ensure equitable heat distribution, preventing prolonged exposure of any single person to colder edges or drafts. You understand now that survival is not an individual endeavor. Heat and protection are shared, distributed, and continuously managed across bodies, terrain, and materials. The sky above remains vast but distant. Your focus is anchored entirely in the immediate environment. Ground texture, airflow, body orientation, and shared proximity define your perceptual landscape. Nothing else matters in this fragile system. Silence deepens yet again, layered with faint processes. Snow settling slowly. Fabric shifting softly with breath and micro-movement. Occasional distant creaks of frozen branches adjusting to weight. Every sound is quiet yet meaningful. You feel the rhythm of endurance continuing without interruption. It is not episodic but continuous. Adjustment, observation, conservation, repetition. The night persists and survival is measured by maintaining equilibrium within it. And as the night continues through this quiet, sheltered space, you realize that survival here is not an act of triumph over cold, but a continuous practice of integration, awareness, and subtle collaboration, where every micro-adjustment preserves life through patient, careful balance. You begin this headed section of the night with a deepened sense of stillness. The cold no longer surprises you. It is not harsh or sudden. It is steady, a constant backdrop against which every movement, breath, and thought is measured. You feel fully immersed in the rhythm of survival attuned to the land, the group, and your own body. The group remains in the sheltered terrain, mostly still yet alive with subtle continuous adjustments. Each person shifts minimally to preserve warmth, rotate circulation, and maintain proximity to shared heat. You notice how every micro-movement carries purpose and intention, forming a delicate balance that supports collective endurance. Fire exists now more as memory than presence. Its imagined warmth shapes posture, spacing, and attention. You sense its influence as a guiding principle that organizes survival beyond the immediate perception of flames. It is the mental anchor for coordination, energy management, and vigilance. A mainstream understanding confirms that indigenous winter survival systems often relied on careful layering of materials, the selection of sites with natural windbreaks and knowledge of seasonal patterns, all of which created microclimates that significantly reduced exposure to extreme cold. These strategies were highly effective even in the harshest winter nights. You notice the snow beneath you. Its surface is calm yet structured, formed over time by wind temperature and repeated pressure. Each layer contributes to insulation, creating subtle differences in heat retention and stability that your body has learned to feel intuitively. A quirky detail preserved in ethnographic accounts describes how small depressions in snow or terrain were sometimes used deliberately as sleeping spots where slight elevation or natural contour reduced exposure to wind, trapped residual warmth, and improved overall comfort during long nights. You imagine yourself lying in such a depression. The snow is compact but still yielding. The surrounding terrain shields the body, and group proximity conserve warmth, and this memory of fire provides a sense of security. The cold is present, but it no longer feels threatening. It is part of the system you inhabit. Historians still debate how much of these survival strategies were the result of formalized teaching versus experiential knowledge. Some argue that children learned through repeated exposure, imitation, and storytelling. Others emphasize the codification of seasonal patterns and environmental indicators into practical survival protocols. Both approaches likely contributed to the resilience observed in historical communities. Your breathing is calm and deliberate. Each inhale warms the cold air. Each exhale releases energy slowly. You notice how subtle micro-adjustments of limbs, posture, and position help maintain circulation and retain heat. Every minor action contributes to survival, even in stillness. Another observation from historical sources describes how insulated bedding layers constructed from combinations of hides, branches, and snow were carefully arranged to create a hierarchy of warmth, minimizing conductive heat loss to frozen ground, while maximizing retention from body heat and nearby companions. You sense the significance of proximity. Warmth is distributed collectively, not individually. The arrangement of bodies combined with environmental features and prepared materials forms an interconnected system that sustains life through coordinated attention. Wind passes faintly above, fragmented and distant. It has lost the power to dominate your experience, shaping the environment only subtly. You're now fully contained within a protective microclimate created by geography, snow structure, and human organization. The group remains in silent coordination. Slight shifts of position, gentle realignments, and careful redistribution of space continue without conscious direction. These actions maintain equilibrium, reduce exposure, and distribute warmth effectively across all members. A lesser-known survival practice mentioned in some accounts involves periodic assessment of extremity warmth, subtle repositioning and rotation of outer positions within a group to ensure that no single individual remains consistently exposed to cold or wind. These small, deliberate actions preserve life through subtle teamwork. You notice the sky above. Stars remain distant and clear, but your awareness is anchored entirely in the immediate environment. The texture of snow, the air around you, the distribution of warmth, and the shared body heat of the group define the full perceptual world. Nothing else matters. Silence deepens. It is no longer empty. It is a landscape of delicate processes. Snow settles slowly. Fabric shifts gently with breathing. Distant creaks of frozen branches respond to accumulated weight. Each sound is minimal, yet carries significance, forming a rhythm that complements the quiet persistence of the night. You feel the rhythm of endurance stretching across hours, continuous and steady. It is not defined by dramatic action, but by the cumulative effect of countless small adjustments, each one preserving warmth, stability, and life. Now, as the night reaches its final hours, you experience the wind down of awareness. Your body and mind are calm. Breathing is slow and deliberate. Muscles relax gradually into the support provided by snow clothing and proximity to others. The environment feels less pressing, as though it too is easing its demands. The cold remains present but no longer dominates. It has become a measured rhythm integrated into your movements and thought. Awareness is quiet, attentive but not tense. Every adjustment has been made, every rhythm learned, every micro-action performed to maintain balance. This final stretch of the night is gentle. The wind softens, snow settles completely, and the group's shared warmth pulses quietly through the space. You feel enveloped, contained, and sustained, connected to the land, the elements, and the continuity of human adaptation. And as you rest in this final stillness, the world feels steady, balanced, and safe. The night is no longer a challenge, but a continuous managed presence. The rhythms of survival fade gently into calm, and the awareness of cold wind and terrain transforms into a quiet companion rather than a threat. Sweet dreams.